Hello and welcome to a complete walkthrough of Dog Catcher, the card game. The setup of Dog Catcher, the card game is 55 cards in essentially 4 suits, plus 2 turnaround cards and a Dog Catcher card. It can be played with 2 to 6 players, but if you're playing with 2 players, you should remove the turnaround cards. Steal 5 cards to each player. Use the remainder of the deck to create a draw pile. The game begins with players taking turns in a clockwise direction. A player's turn consists of 4 possible tasks. First, if a player is past dogs from the previous player, then they can win those with either a higher value card of the same breed or a mutt card. After using cards from their hand to win cards passed to them, they draw to replenish their hand to 5 cards. Player's hand should always have 5 cards before any action is taken. Next, they pass cards to the next player. It can be no more than 5 cards or no more than that player has. The turnaround cards and the dog catcher card do not count. So if a player only has 3 cards, you can only pass 3 dog cards to the next player. And then again, draw to replenish your hand to 5 cards, assuming there are cards left in the draw pile. If a player cannot win all the cards passed to them, or they are past the dog catcher, they draw cards to replenish their hand to 5 if they have used any of their cards to win dogs, and then the turn ends. So the important thing to note here is just because you're past the dog catcher doesn't mean you can't win dogs. It just means that your turn will end before you can pass any dogs. The objective is to win as many dogs as possible and run out of cards without being stuck with the dog catcher card, or, as we like to say, being caught by the dog catcher. So let's do a walkthrough of complete gameplay. So this is a complete game that I'll walk through turn by turn. It is not a discussion of optimal strategy, but rather just possible plays during a game. Start with player 1. Player 1 has 2 husky cards, a 10 and an 8, a 3 lab, a 6 mutt, and 1 Westie treat. So player 1 selects the 2 husky cards that they're going to pass to player 2. Now since player 1 only has 3 cards remaining, they replenish their hand. So they draw a 12 Westie and a 12 husky, and that ends the turn for player 1. And now we shift to player 2. Now player 2 has to decide, do they want to win those 2 huskies now or just add them to their hand? So player 2 has some mutt cards, so they could certainly win these huskies with mutt cards, but player 2 decides to just add them to their hand. They're not going to win cards right now. That makes it player 3's turn. So player 3 has the dog catcher card, a husky card, a lab card, Westie, and a mutt. And player 3 decides that they're going to pass the husky card to player 4. Replenish their hand. Now they have 2 Westies, a lab treat, a mutt, and the dog catcher. So player 4 has to decide, do they want to give the husky a home or, once again, just add it to their hand? They will use their 9 husky to win the 3 husky and give both of those cards a home. And so they collect those, and those will stay with player 4. Then they replenish their hand, and then they decide what they would like to pass. So they have 3 suited Westies. So they're going to select all of their Westie cards to pass to player 1, and then replenish their hand. Now we move to player 1. So player 1 is looking at 3 Westies, which they can win all 3 of these Westies. They can play their mutt card on the 2, the 12 Westie on the 4, and the Westie treat on the Westie 5. Player 1 gives all of those Westies a home, replenishes their hand, and then they select the Husky cards to give to player 2, replenish their hand, and then play moves to player 2. Player 2 decides to win the 7 Husky with the 8, and then play a Mutt card to win the 12 Husky. Give those cards a home. Now notice player 2 still has 5 cards, so player 2 does not replenish at this time. Player 2 passes the 2 lab cards that they have to player 3, then replenishes their hand, drawing a Husky treat and a turnaround card. Player 3 wins the labs with a lab treat and the 4 Mutt, gives all of those dogs a good home, and draws a Mutt card and a turnaround card, selects their Westies and the dog catcher card to place to player 4, and replenishes their hand back to 5. Player 4 now could give the Westies a home. They couldn't go anymore because they have the dog catcher card, and so player 4 just decides to add all of those cards to their hand. Player 1 then decides to pass the lab cards to player 2 and replenish their hand. Player 2 can win the lab cards with Mutt cards, and the Mutts will show those labs a good home. And so they do that, replenish their hand, and then pass all of their Huskies to player 3 and replenish the hand again. Player 3 is not able to give all of the Huskies a home, but does decide to use the Mutt card to give one, the Husky with the treat, a home, and then add the other 2 Huskies to their hand. Player 4 decides to pass all their Huskies and the dog catcher card to player 1, bring their hand back up to 5. Player 1 does not have cards that can beat all of the Huskies, so just adds them to their hand, including the dog catcher card, which ends their turn. So player 2 passes all of the lab cards to player 3 and replenishes their hand. Player 3 has some high lab cards, so they can win the labs with the high lab cards, and they had a Mutt treat. Replenish the hand. Now player 3 passes their Husky cards to player 4 and replenishes their hand again. Player 4 doesn't have any Huskies, but they do have 2 Mutt cards. They use their Mutt cards to give homes to the Huskies and replenishes their hand with the 1 remaining card in the draw pile, which is the 8 of labs. This ends the drawing phase of the game, and from here on players will just play it out without drawing and without replenishing their hand. This is also a situation where a player can have a hand that has less than 5 cards, and therefore you might be limited as to what you can pass to that player because you can't pass more cards to them than they have. Player 4 passes the 3 Westie cards that he has to player 1, and now player 4 only has 1 card remaining. So the draw pile is empty. Play continues until all players are out of cards, but 1 player will be caught with the dog catcher. So player 1 has a high enough Westie and a mutt to win those Westies. So they win the Westie, but then they decide to keep the other two Westies. They're not going to play their mutt right now. So that ends the turn for player 1. Player 2 decides to pass the Husky card and the turnaround card. So since they're playing the turnaround card, they're playing in the opposite direction. So the play is now going to player 1. So the game is turned around. It's now player 1's turn, and player 4 is next. Player 1 gives that Husky a home. Player 4 only has 1 card remaining. So that means that player 1 can only pass 1 dog card to player 4. They do have a dog catcher, and so they could play that, and so that's what they're going to do. They're going to pass their 11 Husky and the dog catcher card to player 4. Player 4 has nothing that can win the Husky, so it adds these cards to their hand. And now it's player 3's turn because gameplay is turned around. Player 3 passes 2 Westies to player 2. And player 2 has the mutt cards to win those Westie cards. And so it does that, gives all 4 dogs a home, has the 1 lab card remaining, passes that to player 1. And player 2 is our first winner because player 2 is out of cards. Game continues with players 1, 3, and 4. Player 1 can play their mutt card to win the lab and give it a home, which they do. And then now that player 4 has 3 cards, they can pass 3 cards to player 4. So they pass 3 Westies to player 4. Player 4 still doesn't have anything to win the Westies with. So player 4 adds them to their hand. And it's player 3's turn. Player 3 now plays their turnaround. So they play the 11 lab and the turnaround in the direction of player 4. So game turns back around, and now player 4's turn is next. So the turnaround card is used, so it comes out of the game, just as the last turnaround card did. And player 4 doesn't have anything that can win the 11 lab, so it adds that to their hand. And so now play is back in the original order, so it's player 1's turn. Player 1 is going to pass cards to player 3, but player 3 only has 1 card remaining. So player 1 plays their highest card, the 6 Husky. Highest card's not a requirement, but that's what player 1 decided to do, to player 3. Player 3 has a mutt card. So they use their 1 mutt card to give the Husky card a home. That mutt and that Husky get good homes with player 3, and now player 3 is the next winner. This means that we're down to player 1 and player 4, and it's player 4's turn. Player 4 can pass 2 cards to player 1 because player 1 only has 2 cards remaining. So he passes the lab cards and the dog catcher card to player 1. Player 1 now doesn't have any cards that can win the lab cards, so they add all of these cards to their hand. Now it's player 4's turn again. Player 4 can now pass up to 4 cards, but since they only have 3 suited, only 3 cards to player 1, so it passes the 3 suited Westies to player 1. Player 1 has no cards that are strong enough to win those Westies, so they add those to their hand. It's player 4's turn again. Player 4 plays their Husky card to player 1. And player 4 is the final winner. And player 1 was caught by the dog catcher. Final scores: player 3 won 14 dog cards. Player 2 won 12 dog cards. Player 4 won 6 dog cards. Player 1, while they did win some dog cards, their score is 0 because they were caught by the dog catcher. Thank you. We hope this walkthrough has helped your gameplay and that you'll enjoy playing Dog Catcher the card game from Teeny Tiny Tiki Games.